Hi, everyone, and welcome to the AI in Healthcare workshop. My name is Haroon Chaudhry. I'm the co-founder and executive director at AI for Anyone, and we're really excited to be bringing you this workshop today in partnership with Komodo Health. And this is especially exciting for me as outside of my role at AI for Anyone, I'm also a data scientist at Komodo Health. So really excited to see both of our organizations coming together for this program. I'm going to hand it off to our director of content, Charmaine, in just a moment to walk you through some details of tonight's event. But first, I want to give you a few details about AI for Anyone, what our organization is, and what Komodo Health is. For those that don't know, AI for Anyone is a nonprofit organization that's focused on improving the AI literacy of our audience. And over the past 3 years, we've been hosting in-person workshops, which we've delivered to over 1,500 students in New York City. A little bit more about Komodo Health. Komodo Health is a health tech company that's focused on reducing the global burden of disease by creating the world's most actionable healthcare map. And we want to give Komodo a big thank you for helping us bring this workshop to life. Near the end of today's event, we'll fill you in on how you can learn more about us and Komodo Health. And before I hand it off to Charmaine, I also want to take a moment to acknowledge this week's events. AI for Anyone has always been a strong proponent of diversity, inclusion, and equality. And it's really at the core of what we do as an organization that essentially is focused on increasing representation in the AI space. And with that being said, we stand in solidarity with the Black community in their struggle. We stand in solidarity with any community that's been a victim to the systemic oppression and racism that plagues our country. And we're committed to doing our part in giving a voice to underrepresented communities and shedding light on the role that AI can play in perpetuating injustices. So with that being said, I'm going to hand it off to Charmaine to walk you through our schedule of events for tonight.
Thanks, Haroon. Like Haroon mentioned, we're excited to have you at the AI in Healthcare workshop today. I'm Charmaine, and I'm the director of content at AI for Anyone. I'll walk you through our agenda for today. We'll kick off today with our workshop. The workshop will teach you, firstly, what is AI in healthcare? Then, how can we find good applications of AI in healthcare? And finally, what challenges does the healthcare industry face in applying AI? Now, this workshop is intended for students and educators, but worry not if you're neither of those things. We're confident you'll still learn plenty from this workshop. Finally, we'll be doing a Q&A at the end where we'll be answering a few of your questions. After the workshop, you'll receive an email containing information on how to get involved with what AI for Anyone is doing, more information on Komodo Health, and some of our favorite resources for learning more about AI. A few more things before we dive right in. As a reminder, this is a virtual workshop, and there are a lot of you on the stream. So in case there are any technical difficulties, just know that we have experts on the call who will be helping us with these issues. We appreciate your patience in advance. Lastly, we want to share our event hashtag. If you decide you want to share anything about this workshop on social media, go ahead and use the hashtag AI in Healthcare. We look forward to seeing all of your posts. Let's introduce the presenters who will be walking you through our presentation today. First up, we have Jeanette, who is our Director of Programs at AI for Anyone. Then we have Ricken, who is a data scientist at Komodo Health. We also have Colin, who is a lead product manager at Komodo Health. You've already met in the beginning, but we also have Haroon, who is the co-founder and executive director at AI for Anyone. I also want to just go ahead and introduce you to some folks working behind the scenes with us today. We have Hamza, who is our director of business development at AI for Anyone. He'll also be moderating our Q&A section today. And last but not least, we have Mac, our Director of Finance, who will be operating the production of today's virtual event. With that, I'm going to go ahead and hand it off to Jeanette for our AI in Healthcare workshop. Go for it.
Thanks, Charmaine. Welcome, everyone. We're really excited to get a chance today to talk to you a little bit about how artificial intelligence is being applied and can be applied in the healthcare industry. Now, during this workshop, we're going to use a tool called Slido. For those of you who have been part of our virtual workshops before, you're a little bit familiar with this tool. It'll allow us to interact with you and ask you questions, get some of your feedback and some of your thoughts as we're going through the workshop live. To use this tool, you can just pull out your cell phone, smartphone, and head over to slido.com, and you enter those 4 characters on the side, K5A3, and you'll be able to give us input based on what you're seeing, and interact with us. So as a really quick sort of jump right in and try it out, you can hop on over there, slido.com K583, and let us know, where are you tuning in from? I'm personally in New York City right now, in my apartment, and trying to stay indoors and safe as much as possible. So I'll give you all a second to try it out, and yeah. Cool. So it looks like we've got some people coming in from plenty of different cities across the country, and a few from outside the country as well. So moving right on, we'll start with framing our conversation today. There's a few key things that we want you to take away from this conversation. The first one is, what do we mean when we actually talk about AI in healthcare? And the second is, how can we identify good applications of AI in healthcare? And finally, what challenges is the healthcare industry going to face in applying AI to improve the work that they do? And to kick things off, we'll start with a really quick introduction of one application of AI in healthcare.
You miss that one?
Oh God, yeah, yeah. She was the angel of my life. She was.
Is loneliness a big problem amongst your generation?
I mean, you know they are, because no one ever goes to visit them. You know, they never see no one. You know, and they go down to town about once a week or twice a week to some shopping, and that's their life. You know.
What about the idea of a robot for a companion?
Was that male or female?
Bill, you haven't dreamt anything for 2 hours.
Hello, Peppa.
Hello.
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 Oh dear.
We could do this forever.
I know we could.
The elderly population is growing. It's a real problem. And there's not enough young people to actually support that elderly population. So there's this demographic time bomb.
Do you want to dance with me?
What dance?
Oh, okay. I'll dance alone.
No.
Bill's taking to her, so I think there's potential. If we could get them to talk properly with us, then it could be a great companion for people.
What else do you do?
The robot can appear in many ways to be empathic and be helpful. And it could well be they could form a relationship with empathic robots. But of course, the robot doesn't form any relationship with them because it's just a machine.
So I'm sure a lot of you have some interesting thoughts and ideas coming and forming from that video, and some questions too. As the man said near the end, it's solving a really important problem. It's solving the problem of trying to take care of our growing elderly population, but there are some challenges with that, right? Is it right to do this? There's a lot of questions we can ask about this, and we're hoping that during this entire workshop, we'll be able to teach you some of the things that you can start thinking about as you start to investigate this problem. But before we do that, I'll just pose a question right to you. Do you think we should be using robots to take care of the elderly? And I'm getting notified here that it seems like the interactive tool is having some difficulty. So perhaps we'll give this another shot and see if it works. But if not, then we'll just move right on. Cool. So I'm getting results off screen over here, and it seems like 80% of you are saying that, yes, we should be using robots to take care of the elderly, which is interesting, right? But there are some problems to think about. What happens when the robot mishears something and does something wrong? We saw a simple example of that where the robot didn't realize that, the old man was asking the robot what dance the robot wanted to do. and the robot misinterpreted that compared to, and in that kind of situation, it's a pretty simple situation. But what happens in a more serious situation? What if the robot misinterprets something, or does something wrong, or does something incorrect? Then who's at fault? And there are some issues to work through with this. And we hope that going through these learning objectives, you'll be able to answer and think about some of these questions yourselves too. And so diving into our very first learning objective, what do we mean when we're talking about AI in healthcare? To understand that, we're probably going to want to understand artificial intelligence. And we did a deep dive of this in our very first virtual workshop, and we encourage you, if you hadn't had a chance to join in then, to go and check that out. But as a really quick summary, what we found is that if you were to look up a definition of artificial intelligence, this is one that you might come across, that AI is when computer systems are doing things that normally need human intelligence. Computer systems are things like your laptop or your smartphone, a lot of the technologies that you interact with on a day-to-day. And when they're doing things that normally need human intelligence, these are things like writing a poem or driving a car or even having a lecture, teaching a lecture to a classroom. Those are all things that we generally consider to need human intelligence. And so I'll pose a question again right back to you. Which of these do you guys think are examples of artificial intelligence? We've got 3 examples here. One is Siri, one is a microwave, and one is a self-driving car. And you won't see these results populating live, but I'll wait for the producers on the back to let me know what you guys think. Cool. So it seems like a lot of you think that Siri are examples of AI, and self-driving cars are also examples of AI, but most of you are convinced that microwaves are not, which does make sense. So with a microwave is not doing anything that we would consider to be intelligent. You put your frozen pizza in the microwave, and you tell it to turn on at this power for this much time. It does that and turns off. It's not making any decisions. It's not doing anything that we consider to be intrinsically human or part of human intelligence. As opposed to, you compare a microwave to a chef, and a chef is doing a lot of intelligent decision making while making you a meal, because the chef is trying to decide what flavors go together. What flavors are you going to enjoy? If I tell a chef, make me a meal, the chef will decide whether that meal is being made in the morning and in the evening and make a different meal based on the time of day. So there's a lot of decision making that goes into there compared to that doesn't happen within a microwave. So Siri and self-driving cars, those are examples of AI, whereas microwaves are not. And when we think about actually building an AI program, right, like let's start by thinking about how we might build a regular computer program, specifically one that's trying to figure out whether something is a tiger or not. And the way we might do that is, we'll have a checklist of things to look for. We'll check to see whether that photo that we're looking at has 4 legs, whether it has a tail, whether it has 2 ears that stick up, whether it has whiskers, and obviously the biggest giveaway, does it have the black and orange stripes? And in this case, in this photo, we see that, yeah, our regular computer program tells us that it is a tiger. But there are some challenges with this too, right? If I look at this photo, I actually, only see 2.5 legs maybe, but I have an understanding of tigers, and I understand that there's actually 4 legs there. How is the computer going to figure that out? Or how do I even describe to the computer where to look for whiskers and what they look like, and how to know if the image has whiskers or not? That's a complicated problem. And finally, what if we were looking at this example, right? This image example also has 4 legs, and it also has a tail, also has 2 ears that stick up, and it's got whiskers, and it's got black and orange stripes. And so a regular computer program would say that, yes, that's a tiger. But even a 2-year-old could tell you that's actually a cat. And so when we think about building this same kind of computer program as an intelligent computer program, the way we do this is by using lots and lots of data, lots and lots of examples. So we would give the computer program lots of examples of tigers and say, here's an image of a tiger, here's another image, here's another image. And then we'd give it examples of things that are not tigers, things like zebras and sloths. And finally, we would give it the edge cases, the things that like could be confused as a tiger, but aren't. Things like cats and lions and leopards. And the computer program, the intelligent computer program, would look at all of this data and through looking at examples would figure out the underlying patterns underneath in order to figure out whether something is a tiger or not a tiger. And the big takeaway that I want you to come away from this with is that when we're trying to describe these complicated rules to a computer, it can be really hard. And sometimes even figuring out what those rules should be in the first place can also be hard. Instead, we teach AI by having it look for patterns in really large amounts of data. Now, what about the other side of this? What about the healthcare side? The definition you might come across when you're looking at healthcare is it's the preservation and improvement of human health. Now, this happens on a level that we're pretty familiar with on a personal level. That's when you go in to see your doctor, or you go in to see a nurse, or you go to the hospital and get treated by a surgeon. These are the things that happen to you on a day-to-day as you interact with the healthcare system. But healthcare also happens at a much, much smaller level. It happens at the molecular level. This is where you have research scientists, people like pharmacists and molecular biologists who are studying the things that make us up, the very little things that make us up, and trying to understand them, trying to understand how they impact our health, and then using that information to preserve and improve our health. And it also happens at a much, much larger scale. And this is what happens at a population level. This is something that, especially if you're in the US, you're probably familiar with Dr. Anthony Fauci, who is an epidemiologist who is trying to come up with the right policies to protect us during this pandemic. And this kind of work happens with policy experts across the spectrum, where they're looking at communities, cities, countries, and across the world to figure out how we can preserve and improve health at the population level. So these are the three different levels at which healthcare is happening every single day. And when we talk about AI in healthcare, it's about enabling the people who work at all of these different levels with the right tools, with the right AI tools to help them preserve and improve human life in ways that can be so much faster and so much more effective than some of the more manual processes that we have today. And with that, I will pass it off to Ricken to talk about identifying good applications of AI in healthcare.
Thanks, Junaid, for that great introduction to artificial intelligence. So our next objective focuses on where we can find good applications of artificial intelligence in healthcare. We'll be diving a little bit deeper into some of these really good examples, and most importantly, looking at the three levels that Junaid talked about: the patient level, the individual level, the molecular level, as well as the population level. So let's start at the patient level. What data or inputs do we have access to here in order to improve healthcare at the patient level? So we've got patient health records. So this is the most relatable form of data. If you've ever gone to the doctor and seen them enter your information on the laptop, this information creates an electronic health record of your visit. There's administrative data. So information in the form of electronic records, when it gets shared to insurance companies, other hospitals, is a form of administrative data. Then you have the more open-ended patient-reported data, such as surveys and questionnaires, medical tests. So when you go to the doctor, you get your blood pressure taken, you get measurements such as height, weight, temperature. And then finally, devices. If you are wearing an Apple Watch, or if you know somebody who has a pacemaker, all of these are creating data points in healthcare data in real time. So talking about all this data, what are some of the applications where we can utilize this data? So some of the outputs here that we have are diagnostic imaging. So let's say a patient gets an MRI or an X-ray. We can use this data to improve diagnosis of disease. Using all these scans for early detection of lung cancer is a really important application. Patient data analysis, again, looking at all this patient level data, we can really analyze a lot of diseases. And then finally, with outcome predictions, not only can we understand these diseases, but come up with better treatments. So with that, let's take a quick look at an example of one of these applications where a radiologist uses data and artificial intelligence for diagnostic imaging.
This is how a radiologist diagnoses pneumonia.
84-year-old female, shortness of breath period, frontal and lateral views of the chest period.
This is an algorithm called ChecksNet that's trained to do the exact same task. And this is how it performed against 6 doctors analyzing 50 chest x-rays for pneumonia in a recent test at Stanford. ChecksNet is one of many projects exploring how artificial intelligence can take over tasks normally done by doctors. And it has some radiologists worried that AI could one day replace them. That's because algorithms are getting really good at interpreting images and diagnosing disease, sometimes with greater accuracy than humans.
We'll take a picture of this X-ray. The model will then run, and within a few seconds output it all these diseases, and they're sorted by the order of most likely to least likely.
ChecksNet was given tens of thousands of images and told which ones have pneumonia and which don't. Then it trained itself to recognize patterns and identify pneumonia in new X-rays.
Wow, that was amazing. It really shows you the power of AI. Think about how much time doctors can save by using these algorithms and how fast they can diagnose diseases, like the example that we saw here in the lung cancer example that I talked about. So as we all are living through, quite literally living through this pandemic, at NYU Current Institute, researchers are actually designing an algorithm, specifically a decision tree model, which Haroon will talk about in a little bit. They're using this model to figure out some of the key indicators of people with coronavirus that are going to develop serious symptoms or serious illnesses. And they've already tried this model with AI. And some of the predictors that they found are levels of enzymes in the liver, symptoms of muscle aches and pains. They've even tied hemoglobin levels to this. So you can see how useful AI can be not only in routine patient care, but also be so helpful during a pandemic where resources are scarce and cases can often become severe. So talking about the individual level, what is happening inside each patient? What is happening at the molecular level? What are some of the data inputs that we have here? So we have the human genome, so our genes, information that we share with our parents. We have DNA sequencing, so DNA from humans, it's in our genes. It's the building blocks that define characteristics about our body, dictate how we speak, how we look. And then finally, there's tissue samples. These genes come together to form cells, which form tissues and which ultimately form organs. And when we're talking about diagnosing diseases at an organ level, tissue sample analysis can be really, really helpful. So with this data, what can we do here? What are some of the applications and outputs at this molecular level? So there's anomaly detection. Analyzing our genes can help us in finding faults in not only better predicting the risk for having certain conditions, but also help us in understanding information that gets transferred from generation to generation. There's drug discovery. So naturally, if we understand these diseases better, we can come up with better treatments. And then finally, in alignment with drug discovery, not only can we build better treatments, but we can really speed up clinical trials and vaccine research. So with that in mind, let's take a look at another example here at the molecular level where AI is really helping in improving healthcare.
I see myself first and foremost as a scientist. I never thought that I would start a company. When I went into my PhD program, I always thought that I would be a professor running a lab, but was just very compelled by the limitations of the drug discovery system and the power of what I saw genomics had to really change the landscape. And I saw that no one else was doing it. And so that's when I left to start the company. And I founded Verge really on the vision of building the first pharmaceutical company that could really develop rapidly multiple transformative treatments for patients. And the ultimate goal for us is to build a scalable drug discovery engine that automates the discovery of cures across every human disease personalized for each patient. Drug discovery is still really a guessing game. And that's why right now it takes over $1 billion in 12 years just to develop a single new drug.
It's quite frustrating, especially you look at the other indications out there, a lot of diseases that are unmet because it takes so long to identify the proper target, the proper pathway that we should be applying therapeutically. You know, why are we still spinning our heads doing traditional drug discovery when we know that it's not working?
We really aim to take the serendipity out of that process with the largest collection of human genomic data in ALS, Parkinson's disease, and Alzheimer's disease, and mining this data to pinpoint the exact gene signatures that are causing disease. We're one of the first teams to truly integrate not only the front end of machine learning infrastructure, but to combine that with wet lab space so that we can rapidly move computational predictions into the lab and generate enormous amounts of data that feed back in and improve our algorithms. And it's really wedding those two fields that will be key to enabling AI technologies to transform the drug discovery landscape.
This is incredible. Most of you have probably seen a microscope or visualized a lab bench when you really think about research, especially research on a molecular level. But this example analysis company should really tell you how some of these algorithms that we're talking about are closely combined with data at the molecular level to completely change how drug discovery is done. So let's take a look at another really, really interesting example. So we have a DNA sequence on the left, which is just a string of letters, and then a cool three-dimensional structure on the right. And you might be wondering what this is. So this structure on the right is a folded protein. So protein folding is a really important process in the human body, but why is it so challenging and what does it mean? Think about so let me give you an analogy. Think about a magic Lego set, and I'll talk about the magic in a second. Let's say that this set also comes with a manual for how you're going to connect these Legos together. You start playing around and you connect the Legos of different colors together in a certain combination. All of a sudden, let's say this string of Legos magically converts into a cool shape. Let's say like the Millennium Falcon. You look back at the manual and it says that each time you change the order of the Legos in the string, you'll get a different shape. This is what protein folding is. So the DNA is kind of like your manual, and the colored Legos are the building blocks of proteins. So what does this really mean for healthcare? Let's say I gave you all the Lego blocks for the Millennium Falcon, but I didn't tell you that the blocks are for the Falcon, and I didn't even give you the instructions on how to assemble the Legos. You'd probably be pretty lost. And trying to solve that problem is the protein folding problem. These proteins folded like structure, like the one that you see here, each serve a different purpose in the human body and often help us fight the spread of disease. And to solve the protein folding problem, companies like DeepMind, which is a Google company, is using artificial intelligence to predict the shape of these proteins accurately and in fast time. So you can see how useful all of this can be when thousands of proteins are working together and folding at the same time. So with that, we've covered a lot of stuff at the patient level as well as the molecular level. What's happening at the population level? What's happening when all of this data comes together on a large scale? Let's look at some of the data inputs that we have here. So we have census data, pretty self-explanatory. The record of a population in a certain area, demographics of a state, or even data on the national level. Healthcare systems data, so all those inputs that we talked about on the patient level, like electronic medical records, health records, all come together to form healthcare systems data. And then finally, migratory patterns like travel data, migration data, immigration data. We need to keep track of travel data, especially now when we're continuously trying to track the spread of the virus. So how can this data on the population level help us in healthcare? What are some of the outputs here? So the first one, outbreak detection. This is probably the one we can relate to most in this time. We use computers and AI to better predict the size of a pandemic. We've probably also heard about how we're predicting resources that we're going to use. You've probably seen estimates of how many people could get infected or how many doctors we're going to need. And we'll elaborate a little bit on this in a second. And then clinical trial planning. So finding good candidates and spotting potential issues with the development of a drug. AI can really help with finding the right candidates. And when all of this data comes together on a population level, can really efficiently speed up a trial. So talking about data at the population level, we can think about something like a healthcare map. All of these different data points from the census and healthcare systems data come together as flags for a patient's journey through the system. Komodo Health has built an extensive version of this map. A map such as this can be especially useful when trying to find patients with a rare disease, as well as educating doctors. And an example of such a disease is HATTR, which you see on the right. HATTR is a genetic mutation of the TTR gene and often involves serious symptoms like headaches, can lead to dementia, as well as swelling of the feet. And to give you an idea of how rare this disease is, there's actually only 50,000 people that are living with this disease worldwide. So this healthcare map, where can it help? It helps in contacting doctors so that they can test individuals early. But where does AI come in? So you can imagine how hard it would be to find each of these patients around the world manually or through an open-ended search. However, with a healthcare map, not only can you see all of these patients with HATTR in one place, but you can link their journeys together to see what treatments they underwent, what routine checkups they underwent, but also find a lot of patients that might be at the risk for developing HATTR. And when you feed this data as an input to an AI algorithm, it can identify what are the best sites, what are the best doctors that we should contact. And in a specific case like this, using the map, for example, you can test about 28 times the original number of patients that you wanted to test. This really shows you, again, the power of AI on a population level. So with that, let's take a look at what's going on with AI in the current pandemic, what Blue Dot is doing.
I'm Lindsay Bryson. I'm the Chief Operating Officer of a company called Blue Dot. We're a digital health company that tracks the spread of infectious diseases globally and assesses their risk of spread and impact worldwide. What we've done at Blue Dot is we've built a global early warning system for infectious diseases, and there's 3 pillars to that. So the first one is global surveillance for infectious diseases, and we are mapping out over 200 diseases in near real time, 24/7, processing over 100,000 articles a day in over 65 languages, just to understand what's happening. And that's using our AI-enabled machine. Second is understanding what the impact of spread is going to be. So where are these diseases going to spread to, and what is going to be their impact once they reach their destination? And then finally, we essentially communicate this via our software platform, alert our clients of this early warning in the locations of interest so that they can better inform policy decisions and be prepared for these outbreaks. During COVID, on December 31st, we picked up news in a Chinese local newspaper, translated it into English, that essentially warned of this pneumonia-like disease that we were seeing in a food market. We quickly realized there were some similarities to SARS, and within minutes assessed global spread looking at air travel to understand where the dispersion might be globally if this was going to turn into something bigger than it was. So on that same day, we were able to alert our clients that there is this risk of a SARS-like illness that could spread. And that was our first alert on December 31st. And then by January 14th, we had published this in the academic literature and correctly predicted 10 out of 12 of the first cities that were going to see their first cases of what is now known as COVID.
Wow, again, a really powerful example of what AI is doing in real time through this pandemic. And really, I hope that the examples and the applications that we've talked about thus far give you an idea of how AI plays a role in healthcare, as well as helps you recognize some of these use cases on each of these 3 levels that we talked about. So with that, I'll hand it off to Colin, who's going to talk to you about some of the challenges that AI in healthcare faces.
Thanks, Ricken. All right, so now we come to our 3rd learning objective, which is what challenges does the healthcare industry face in applying AI? As exciting as the possibilities of AI are, effective development and implementation can be really challenging, right? And healthcare in particular faces some strong challenges. Overall, there are many potential challenges we could explore, but today we're going to focus on 3 specific areas: privacy, compatibility, and explainability. So first, let's dive into the idea of privacy. When you think about your personal data, your healthcare data might be the most sensitive of all the personal data that exists. And the challenges around privacy in healthcare really kind of reflect that sensitivity. If a person knows your DoorDash history, they might know that you eat a lot of bagels, but it's probably less concerning than if somebody finds out every medication maybe you've ever taken in your life, right? So, with that in mind, let's dive into some specific aspects of privacy that are going to be challenging in the application of AI. First, there's the question of regulations, right? For obvious reasons, regulation is or healthcare is a highly regulated industry. But while many of these regulations are well-intended, in some cases they're kind of outdated, which makes innovation really challenging. HIPAA, which stands for the Health Insurance Portability and Accountability Act, was originally passed in 1996. It's the law that probably most impacts what we think about patient data privacy, as it relates to AI development. And while it's been revisited and updated a little bit since its original passing in '96, it really kind of needs a more major overhaul to kind of address some of the new challenges that face AI today. Next, there's the question of anonymization, right? Many applications of AI use non-identifiable data sets in order to train the models that they develop, right? And while anonymization is tricky with any personal data, it can be especially difficult in healthcare because a lot of the most important data aspects are things that you really kind of care about from a modeling perspective, whether that's race, gender, underlying health conditions. Those are all pieces of data that you probably need to train your model, which would also be considered identifiable. Additionally, even after removing the most obvious identifiable information, there may still be re-identification risk. For example, if you say how many people went to see Dr. Smith on May 1st and talked about a back injury, that actually probably narrows down to a pretty small group, right? And so you may have removed the really obvious personally identifiable information, like name or social security number, but you've actually kind of created a new re-identification risk through creating a very specific kind of patient cohort. Effective anonymization is critical to maintain trust, but a lot of nuances need to be considered. Next, when it comes to privacy, there's the bigger challenge of ethics and trust. People really want to trust that their data is being handled securely, used responsibly, and that the AI solutions being developed are ethical and trusted. Medical ethics is a really important part of medical education, and healthcare practitioners face really challenging ethical questions every day. A really concrete example of a challenging ethical situation that healthcare practitioners face is the idea of triage, right? Triage is if you have limited healthcare resources, how do you decide who gets access to those resources? It's something that's been really sort of brought to light in the context of the COVID crisis, as we'll see in this video that we're about to watch now.
It's been like a war zone, a medical war zone. So before I start my shift, I have to pray and meditate for at least 5 minutes to get my mind in the setting of going into this war.
As hospitals are flooded with more critically ill patients than they have the resources to treat, they've had to start prioritizing who is given the chance to live and who isn't. It's an old wartime practice known as triage, but now it's come to life in peacetime. It's the process of sorting patients according to a system of priorities in order to save the greatest number of people possible. It can often determine who lives or dies. And in Italy, the biggest crisis since World War II has in some cases already forced doctors to decide which COVID-19 patients will have access to a ventilator and which ones won't. So who gets priority? Triage systems can vary from hospital to hospital, but priority is normally given to those most likely to be saved and most likely to live longer.
So maximization of outcomes, that definitely sounds like something that AI could help with, right? But when it comes to the case of patients' health, it comes with some really hard ethical trade-offs. And so for our next Slido question, I want to ask the audience, do you think it's the right choice to use an AI system to triage patients in an ER, for example? The AI algorithm may definitely be sort of smarter than the very kind of human process that takes place, but there is also a huge kind of ethical judgment component that's a part of the problem. So I'm looking at my phone, I can see the answers that are kind of coming in, and there's definitely kind of no obvious answer here, right? There's no right answer, and as you've talked about earlier, there's a lot of clinical context where AI is going to be able to help with decision making. But what's an acceptable error rate when the stakes are so high? No model is going to be perfect; it's going to make mistakes. But physicians also make mistakes, right? What error rate do we accept with our actual sort of normal treatment process today? Can you have a malpractice lawsuit against an algorithm? How does that even work? And then finally, how do you avoid the idea of bias, right? Bias is going to be a challenge if you're training data sets to reflect the underlying disparities that happen in healthcare every day. There's been cases of researchers identifying racial bias in healthcare algorithms to date. So that's something you kind of need to be really aware of. It's a challenging set of questions, but I think the most important thing is thoughtfulness and intentionality by researchers and developers into developing these solutions. So, there we covered privacy. Let's kind of jump to our next challenge we're going to talk about, which is the compatibility of the data we want to use. We hear all the time about the explosion of big data. There's so much big data, all this data is in the world, and healthcare is no exception. But despite this explosion of data, it's not always really easy to be able to combine all that data together into the relevant data that we need for modeling. It could live in different places, and it might be in different formats. To explain this, let's kind of go through a very specific example. Let's think about your social media presence, right? You may have a Facebook account, and maybe there you post your status and some photos. You have your Instagram, where that's where you have your photos and stories and things you share with your friends. You might have Snapchat, where you have some streaks and stories that are going with people. You have your really cool viral videos on TikTok and all those dances. And then finally, maybe you have a professional social presence you have on LinkedIn. If I wanted to get a really kind of comprehensive view of your social presence, I'd really need to be able to pull data from all of those different websites and combine it into sort of one record. But for obvious reasons, that'd be really, really difficult. Each of those companies doesn't necessarily have a business incentive to make it happen. And the formats are going to be really different. Healthcare works the exact same way. Your healthcare data that exists is really kind of spread a lot against a lot of different places. Some data is going to live with your doctor in the electronic health record, like Rick had talked about earlier. Some will live with your insurer. Some is going to be maybe on your Apple Watch or your Fitbit. The data is really kind of fragmented. And even if you manage to bring it together, it's not necessarily going to be in a format that makes it very easy to combine, right? So this is where companies like Komodo and some of the challenges that we're trying to solve in sort of unifying all these data sets into ground truth is one way you kind of go about this problem. Additionally, the industry as a progress is really trying to make whole, right? There's the development of a lot of new data standards. One that I want to call in particular is called FHIR, which stands for Fast Healthcare Interoperability Resources. You can kind of think of this as a common language that allows different EHR systems to speak to each other. But as you can imagine, getting everyone on board takes a long time. Healthcare is not really known as being a particularly fast-moving industry, right? So we have a lot of progress to make to really maximize the potential of all the healthcare data that exists out there. So we've talked about privacy, we talked about compatibility, and the final challenge when we talk about AI in healthcare, let's talk a little bit about explainability. For AI in healthcare, it's really important often to understand how an AI model works. Understanding why a particular diagnosis or recommendation being made is really critical. However, some models make this kind of difficult. So let's do a quick thought exercise. So let's look at the example of a car engine versus a bicycle. When you have a car engine, when you first learn how to drive, you learn that, hey, if I press down the accelerator, the car goes forward, right? But if you were first to explain, hey, why does this happen? Depending on your sort of experience with kind of mechanical engineering or how well you kind of know the internal combustion engine, you might not really know the exact sort of set of components and things that sort of mean, hey, it leads to the drive shaft, and hey, that turns the wheels, and that makes the car go forward. For most people, in most cases, you kind of take this idea that, hey, pedal go down, car go forward, kind of a little bit on faith. This is more similar to what we'd probably describe as a black box model, right? You kind of understand the inputs and you understand the outputs, but you don't always know exactly how or why the model is working. Let's contrast that with a bicycle, for example. So a bicycle also has a pedal. You also press the pedal and the bicycle goes forward, but it's a lot easier to trace the chain from, hey, there's the pedal and I see that it connects to this gear connects to this chain, the chain connects to the gear on the wheel, that turns the wheel, the bicycle goes forward. It's the same principle of input in, output, but you can really clearly sort of explain the steps. This is more similar to what we might call a white box model, right? A lot of models in AI are actually what we would call black box models. You sort of have inputs that you go in, outputs come out, and while you get a recommendation, the model doesn't always make it really specifically clear how exactly it got to that recommendation or prediction. In a lot of contexts, this is going to be totally fine. If you get a video recommended to you kind of in your YouTube feed, you don't really need to know exactly why that particular video has been recommended. But if you think of the case where, hey, a doctor comes to you and they say, hey, this AI algorithm says you have 3 months to live, but I can't tell you why the algorithm thinks that, you can see very quickly why that wouldn't be something that's acceptable. So, how do we then kind of deal with this problem? There's really a couple common approaches that you can sort of think about. The first is you can develop a white box model to actually explain your black box model. If the black box model is the one you really want to optimize for, you can sort of add a second model into the equation. And when this works, it's really, really great, but it's not going to work in every single application. And it adds a lot of complexity very quickly. The other option is you say, hey, maybe I just can't use a black box model. I need explainability, and so you have to go with a white box model. But this is often going to come at the expense of performance, right? The idea of kind of performance versus explainability is a really common one in AI modeling. And so, it's trade-offs that you need to consider because you've added a really hard constraint at the beginning of your modeling process that this needs to be explainable at the end. So after reviewing these three areas of privacy, compatibility, and explainability, I hope you have a better sense of some of the challenges that face the development of AI in healthcare. And now I'm going to hand it over to Haroon, who's going to take us through a quick practical exercise that brings to light a lot of the concepts we've discussed.
Thanks so much, Colin. So let's now learn about an AI model that has a high degree of explainability and gets used pretty often to predict with healthcare data, the decision tree. We're going to build our own decision tree together in just a bit, but first let's dig more into what it actually is. A decision tree is a flowchart-like structure that uses a tree-like model of decisions and their potential consequences. And like an actual tree, our decision tree has its own versions of roots, branches, and leaves. Like an actual tree, everything stems from the root or the root node. This is a very first test in our decision tree. And also similar to an actual tree, at the end of the tree are leaves or leaf nodes, which you'll find at the very right of this decision tree diagram here. And each of these represents a class label, or in other words, a result. In our case, the result is either that an example is a Disney Plus subscriber or is not. And all the other pink dots or nodes in the decision tree are essentially tests that determine which branches to follow. So whether someone has children or whether they were born in the US or not. So for example, if we want to classify whether Mark Cuban or Malala Yousafzai are Disney Plus subscribers or not using our decision tree, we could do that. So if we took Mark Cuban as our first example and walked through the decision tree, we would start at the root node. And our first test is whether Mark is over the age of 30 or not. And he's age 61, so yes, he is. So we would move along the top branch. And our next test is whether Mark has children or not. And he does in fact have children, so we'll move along the next top branch. And so now, according to our decision tree, we know that Mark Cuban is a Disney Plus subscriber. And if we did the same for Malala, we would start at the root node, and we would know that she's under the age of 30. I think she's 22, and she was not born in the US. So we would move towards the bottom of that branch there, and we would conclude that she's not a subscriber. A decision tree doesn't always need to give us a definitive answer either. It could provide us with a likelihood or a chance that somebody is of a certain class instead. So in our hypothetical example, there might be an 80% chance that Mark Cuban is a Disney Plus subscriber and only a 5% chance that Malala is a Disney Plus subscriber. One of the reasons why decision trees are so great is because they give you a pretty clear picture of how the model is making its decisions. And if we go back to the terms that Colin used earlier, decision trees would be considered white box models because it's pretty easy to explain how they made their decisions. All you have to do is look at the attributes that the tree split on. And a good decision tree is one that gives you the most information gained from each split. That means the tree will be as short as possible, and all of the examples that fall into any of the given leaf nodes will be as similar to each other as possible. And a bad decision tree is exactly the opposite. It'll be bigger than it needs to be, and there will be less similarity between the examples in each of the leaf nodes. So now that we know what a decision tree is, let's build a simple example of one. Let's say we have a training data set of 50 people, and we want to build out a decision tree that determines whether someone has antibodies or not. And for those that don't know, an antibody is essentially something your body makes when you're fighting an infection, like COVID-19. And that's essentially how you build immunity to a virus. And for our purposes, let's assume that half of those in our training set have antibodies and half of them don't. The three attributes we're given about each of these people are their height, whether they have 20/20 vision or not, and whether they have black hair or not. And having 20/20 vision or having black hair are both binary attributes. You either have them or you don't. Height isn't binary, it's continuous, but let's simplify this for our example and let's change it to a yes or no answer. So let's say, let's change our test to whether someone is over 5'10" or not. All right, so let's choose what the first branch is that we're going to split on. I know Slido's not working, but I'm going to pull up my phone so that I can see the answers here. So far, it looks like most of the answers are for height. All right, so the jury has spoken, and our root node will be height. So that will be the very first attribute that we split on. And it looks like we're not getting much information from that. So if we separated our training group into those that are tall or those that are not tall, we're not really getting much information. I mean, around 50% for each of the different splits. And that's basically just as much information as you would get by flipping a coin. So not really great there. So let's do another split. So let's choose where to split for those that are tall. Let's choose an attribute to split on here. So either vision or hair. All right, looks like vision has the lead, just narrowly right now. All right, so we're at 200 responses, so let's go with vision. It's about 60% of you chose vision here. And so when we pick vision, we can see that we have a little bit more information, right? So we're a little bit more confident about classifying those in any of these given leaf nodes. 69% of those that are tall and that have 20/20 vision have antibodies, and 42% of those that are tall and don't have 20/20 vision have antibodies. So we're further away from that 50-50 split, and we have a little bit more confidence here. All right, so the point of this exercise actually wasn't to figure out what the best decision tree would look like for determining whether somebody has antibodies or not. It's actually to illustrate the point that when it comes to developing very complex models, such as the ones that would actually be used to predict whether someone has antibodies or not, there's often a lot of ambiguity involved. And in our simplified example, we had a very limited set of features to work with. And frankly, they're not all that helpful. I mean, height and 20/20 vision, I don't really know if they're predictive of whether someone has antibodies or not. They're probably not. And if we wanted to create a more useful model, we'd want to use a lot more features and a lot more data. That's what makes decision trees so powerful. So what if we had 1,000 samples and 10 features? Or what if we had 1,000,000 samples and 1,000 features? It'd be nearly impossible for us to find the optimal tree by doing it manually like we just did in our exercise, picking feature by feature. This is where AI plugs in. We can use AI to develop a decision tree that picks the features that'll give us a tree with leaves where we can have the highest certainty of our prediction outcomes. It'll enable us to use statistical techniques to determine which splits give us the most information gain at any given node. That's what makes AI so powerful. All right, with that being said, I'm going to hand it back off to Junaid to conclude our workshop.
Thank you so much, Harun. So we started today with 3 learning objectives that we wanted to cover. What do we mean when we're talking about AI in healthcare? How can we identify good applications of it? And 3, what challenges are we actually going to face in applying AI in this industry? And we saw that ultimately AI is a tool that we can use to help the people working in the industry, whether they're at the patient level, molecular level, or population level, to preserve and improve human health. And when looking for good applications of AI, we need to look for the data at each of these 3 levels and try to understand how we can apply them to help those people do their jobs. And finally, we're going to face challenges, especially with privacy, compatibility, and explainability when making sure that AI is used effectively in this industry. And with that, I'll pass it off to Hamza to run a really quick Q&A.
Awesome. Thank you, Junaid. Let me add back all of the panelists to help answer some of these burning questions. Okay, awesome. Yeah, let me pull up some questions from the audience. Junaid, I think you can probably take on the first one. A common question that we had from our viewers is, as a high school student pursuing a career in medicine, should I expect AI to be a big part of my training or duty as a physician? What can I do now to prepare?
That's a really fantastic question. We've been lucky to talk to a lot of high school students about AI, and we get these types of questions pretty often about, is it going to impact my career in this industry or in that industry? And I think there's a couple things to think about. Number one is, it's always useful, no matter the industry you're going into, to understand at least the basics of how AI works. Because then not only are you have a better understanding of how it's going to impact your day-to-day life, but you can also start to see how you can apply it in your job in the future, whatever your career ends up being. Specifically in healthcare, we definitely see that it's being adopted more and more within the healthcare industry. But the way we imagine that it'll likely be implemented is that it's going to be a tool that doctors will be using. So it'll be important for them to understand it so that they can interpret what those tools are telling them. But they won't be necessarily building the tools themselves. That's where they'll rely on the technical experts, the data scientists, to build the tools for them. However, having that understanding of AI is really important. And then there's the other side of it, which is you can still be a part of the healthcare industry, even if, blood makes you squeamish, because you can still help improve people's lives by building tools like this for other folks.
Awesome. Ricken, let's go on to you for the next question. When we discover potential new drugs, we run clinical trials to make sure they work effectively. How do we do the same kind of testing for AI algorithms?
That's a great question. I think there's a lot to effectiveness, but some of the ways that we can measure it is one is how accurate the algorithm or the model that you're building is. And to give you guys a quick example, I mean, Haroon talked about the decision tree, which was going through the different steps to find the best candidates. But how do you really know how accurate this model is? And one of the ways that you can do that is you can take a smaller subset, which you already have the answers for, and you can use some of that subset to teach and train your model. And then you can test that model on a separate set, which you already have the answers to. And when you compare these predicted results to the answers that you already have, you kind of get a good idea of how accurate your model is going to be. And as you train and improve this model, that's how you get really, really effective algorithms. And another quick way to think about effectiveness is to see how up to date your model is going to be. So really tracking changes in some of the data inputs that we talked about. So the population census data, healthcare systems data, really helps you keep your models up to date. So you can quickly think of if we develop a vaccine, or if you develop an algorithm that helps with the coronavirus, and let's say there's a second wave later this year, there's going to be a lot of changes, and data scientists and people using artificial intelligence are going to have to adjust these models to make accurate predictions once again. So that's really some of the ways that you can measure effectiveness. Obviously, there's a lot more to that, but hopefully that relates to some of the stuff that we talked about.
Awesome. No, that's super helpful. Colin, so I am very curious about the answer to this question. Could the use of AI affect the cost of healthcare?
Yeah, it's a great question. And I think, healthcare costs are something that we're all very kind of curious about and worried about, right? I think the answer is, over the long term, almost definitely yes, right? I think, AI in general, makes systems more efficient. I think there's a lot of inefficiency in how the health system operates today. And so I see a lot of gains there. I think it's going to be harder to realize those gains in the short term than people kind of necessarily give it credit for, right? I think, really the things that drive healthcare costs are very complex and are having a large health economic scale. And, it's actually a little bit of a barrier to development of AI algorithms, right? If proving that your particular algorithm, maybe, whether that becomes your product, is something that really drove that individual cost benefit, that's something that actually could be a real challenge, right? And so I think it's going to take some time for some of the payment systems to really adapt to kind of how to handle and think about these types of situations. Two areas I'll highlight where I think there's some really immediate kind of cost benefits to the system. One is, as Ricken kind of talked about earlier, clinical trial development. The cost of clinical trials is very, very, very high. And so, anything that you can do to really kind of improve that process is going to be incredibly valuable. Another one that's a little bit simpler, but people may not realize, is something as simple as kind of staffing for nurses at a hospital, right? Capacity planning for how many nurses you need to have on staff is really kind of critical, because if you get that wrong, you may actually have to end up hiring a lot of nurses on contract. That's going to drive up some of your overall costs. Those costs kind of get baked into the system, right? And so, just to restate the answer, the short answer is absolutely yes, but maybe not as quickly as people would hope for.
Awesome. And just to close things out, Haroon, hopefully you can put some of these future doctors at ease. Will AI replace doctors?
Yeah, well, that's a really good question. I think that the short answer here is probably not, in terms of replacing doctors entirely, but I do think that AI is going to profoundly change the role that doctors play and their day-to-day responsibilities, how they interact with their patients. The way that I like to think about it, not only specific to healthcare, but a lot of white-collar professions in general, is that AI will play a role more as a augmenter, as opposed to being a replacer of jobs entirely. So for doctors specifically, it may help eliminate a lot of the more monotonous, mundane tasks that doctors spend so much time on. I think I read somewhere that doctors spend, somewhere upwards of 30 to 50% of their time doing administrative tasks. And so with good AI applications, we could hopefully reduce that so that doctors can do what they do best, and that's interact with patients, diagnose patients properly, give them the proper treatments and the proper prognosis that they need. And AI will also enable them to get more relevant data, right? So rather than having to memorize a bunch of research papers and clinical research, AI can absorb a lot lot of the data that doctors may store in their own minds currently when it comes to making these types of decisions. So I think the way that I like to think about it is that AI will play a role as an augmenter for these types of white-collar professions. And the more that doctors can get familiar with these types of technologies, the better of a position they'll be in to be successful in the future.
Awesome. Thank you
Yeah,
all
I think
again.
just to quickly touch on that a little bit as well. If you think about just on a human level, when you go and see your doctor and they tell you that this is something that you have, like your hemoglobin levels are high or your vitamin B12 is low or whatever it happens to be, right? That's not all you want to know. You want to understand, what is this going to mean for me specifically? Is it something that I should expect for myself? Like, how do I deal with this situation now? You're looking for an answer about how to actually improve your health from the doctor, not just what is wrong or what is right with my body. So that's where doctors come into play.
Totally. Awesome. Thank you all again for such a great and informative session. I'll hand the mic back to Charmaine to close things out.
Thanks, Hamza, and thank you to all our speakers. Thank you so much for joining us. We hope you learned something new and hope this felt like a small breath of fresh air in these crazy times. For those of you who are itching to learn more right now, we'll be sending you more resources to learn about AI and more specifically AI in healthcare. We'll also include information on how you can learn more about us and Komodo Health. Be on the lookout in your email inbox in the next couple of days. Follow our social media channels for updates on our upcoming events. You can find the links in the description down below. And with that, we hope you enjoy the rest of your evening or day wherever you are. Stay safe, take care, and see you all soon. Thank you.